rented a small cabin for a weekend getaway a few months back. It was supposed to be a solo trip to just clear my head before starting a new job. The cabin was located in a state park area, about 3 hours from my apartment, so it was isolated enough to feel like an adventure, but close enough to drive home if I needed to. When I arrived, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin was exactly what you picture when you think of cabin. It looked cool in the photos. But standing there in the twilight, I realized that a glass window basically turns the inside of the cabin into a lit stage for anyone standing in the dark woods. I shook off the creepy vibe, unlocked the door, and hauled my gear inside. The place was modern enough. It had electric heat and a decent kitchen, but the breaker panel and the utility box were located on a pole about 20 feet from the back deck, near the gravel driveway. I noticed it when I parked because the box was slightly rusted and buzzing a little, but I didn't think much of it. I got settled in, cracked a beer, and threw some steaks on the cast iron skillet. It was fully dark by the time I sat down to eat. I had the interior lights on bright. Midway through my meal, the cabin went black. It was pitch black. I figured I had probably tripped a breaker by running the electric heater and the stove at the same time. I used my phone flashlight to navigate to the back door. I wasn't thrilled about going outside in the cold, but I needed the heat back on. I walked out onto the deck, down the stairs, and over to the utility pole. Sure enough, the main breaker switch was flipped to the off position. I thought it was weird that the physical switch had thrown itself all the way down, but I just flipped it back up. I locked the box cover back down and headed inside. I finished my dinner and started washing the dishes. I was feeling a little more relaxed, humming along to a podcast, when it happened again. This time, the silence felt heavier. A breaker shouldn't trip again if I wasn't running anything new. I actually had less stuff on now than before. I wiped my hands and grabbed my phone again. I was annoyed now. I figured the breaker itself was faulty, and I'd have to call the owner in the morning. I walked to the back door, but before I opened it, I hesitated. I crept up to the glass window in the living room. I pressed my face against the cold pane and cupped my hands around my eyes to block out the reflection of my phone screen. I aimed my light toward the utility pole in the driveway. I moved the beam slightly to the left and saw a man standing right next to the utility pole. He was looking straight at the back door of the cabin. It was really unnerving seeing him, just standing there holding the switch. I turned off my flashlight immediately, so he wouldn't see me standing in the window. I wanted to leave right then, but my car was parked around the back, right next to where he was standing. I just stood in the dark kitchen for a long time, listening to see if he would come closer. I didn't know what to do, so I eventually called the police and waited in the bedroom until they arrived. By the time they got there, the guy was gone. I packed up my stuff and drove home that night. I still think about it when I'm alone. I'm pretty sure if I had gone out that back door the second time the lights went out, I wouldn't be writing this right now. And the weirdest part is, I never heard a car pull up or drive away. He must have walked there from the woods, just to mess with the power. I was on a solo fishing trip up in the Boundary Waters last August. The weather had turned pretty sour, raining on and off for 2 days straight, so taking the boat out was basically a waste of time. The area I was staying in wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot. It was mostly just logging roads and endless pine trees, but I was just driving around because I didn't want to sit in my motel room staring at the wall. I found it kind of interesting how, along this one gravel service road, there were these faint deer trails cutting into the brush. They all looked overgrown and impossible to walk through, like they hadn't been used in years. But one of them caught my eye. It was wider than the others, almost like an old ATV path, and just from the way the trees arched over it. I couldn't figure out where it would actually lead, since the map showed nothing but swamp in that direction. I tried to peer down it from the warmth of my truck, but the canopy was too thick and the gray daylight didn't penetrate very far. My boredom won out over my common sense, and I decided to park the truck and walk it just to kill an hour. I was thinking it probably led to an old deer stand or maybe a dumping ground for yard waste, but really, walking in the drizzle was better than watching reruns of old sitcoms back at the lodge. I walked for about 20 minutes, which was way deeper than I planned on going, until the path just sort of dissolved into a clearing. I pushed through a wall of wet ferns, and that's when I saw it sitting there, a shack that looked like it had been dropped from the sky into the middle of the marsh. The siding was stripped gray by the weather, and the roof had a massive sway in the middle, like a broken spine. I walked up to the porch, stepping over a rotted step, and saw that the front door was hanging off its top hinge, wedged open at a weird angle. The woods were dead silent because of the rain, making the inside look like a black hole. I took a few steps closer until I was squeezing past the broken door. It was gloomy inside, but I could make out piles of garbage and a mattress that had been torn to shreds by animals. I pulled out my phone to use the flashlight, then stepped fully inside. It was just one main room, mostly gutted, but there was a narrow opening in the back wall that didn't have a door. I looked in and saw a small pantry area that smelled terrible, like wet fur and mold. But on the floor of the pantry, there was a square hole cut into the wood planks. It was definitely unsettling and gave me a weird vibe. But considering the place looked like it hadn't seen a human in 20 years, I didn't feel like I was in any immediate trouble. I walked to the edge of the hole and looked down. A wooden ladder led down into a crawl space that had been dug out of the earth. I held my phone light over the edge and saw that it wasn't just a dirt hole. Someone had lined the walls with plastic tarps. My light didn't reach the back corners of the hole, but I could see a sleeping bag rolled up on the dirt floor. I was too nervous to climb down there, so I just crouched at the edge and squinted. From my vantage point, I could see a few empty food containers, the plastic looking strangely new compared to the trash upstairs, and everything past that was swallowed by the shadows. A bad feeling started creeping up my neck, and it was right then that I decided I had seen enough. I stood up to turn around and leave the pantry, but as I swung my phone light back toward the main room, the beam caught something standing behind the open front door. I threw myself backward, slamming into the door frame hard enough to bruise, and scrambled into the rain. I just kept my head down and crashed through the brush, tearing my jacket on the thorns, stumbling over roots until my boots hit the gravel of the service road. The memory of him standing silently in the corner, just watching me look into his basement, keeps me out of the woods to this day. This past autumn, I spent a week at a hunting shack that a coworker of mine owns. It's a single-room A-frame that is pretty much buried in the tree line, but he lets people from the office use it during the off-season if they want a quiet place to disconnect. I had never really considered going out there because he always warned us that it was primitive. No running water, just a rain catch system, and the heat came entirely from an old cast-iron stove. The only reason I took him up on it this time was that I had some PTO I needed to burn before the end of the year, and I didn't have the budget to fly anywhere. When I arrived, I was honestly shocked by how dense the woods were. I knew it was going to be secluded, but this place felt like it was swallowed by the forest. I parked my truck on the gravel pad and hauled my cooler inside. It wasn't fancy, but for a free place to crash, it was decent enough. I got my gear unpacked and spent the first hour just figuring out the quirks of the place. I had to prime the hand pump at the sink and chop some kindling for the stove. I made myself some dinner on the propane burner and sat out on the small deck with a book. There was zero signal out there, but I had downloaded a bunch of music to keep me occupied. I really wasn't paying attention to the time, but a few hours before sunset, I put my book down to stretch. I looked out toward the tree line, and that's when I saw him. There was a man standing perfectly still in the gap between two large pines, maybe 50 yards away. He wasn't hiking or walking. He was just standing there, facing the cabin. He was wearing dark clothes, blending in with the shadows, which made him hard to spot at first. I watched him for a minute, waiting for him to wave or move, assuming it was a neighbor, or maybe a hunter scouting the land. I stayed on the deck for another few minutes to make sure he wasn't approaching, then went back inside. Being in such a remote shack on private land made it really terrifying to know there was a stranger just watching from the perimeter. I locked the deadbolt and used a battery lantern to get settled in the loft, then crawled into the sleeping bag. I eventually fell asleep. In the morning, I woke up with the sun and brewed some coffee, hanging around the shack until noon, then decided to take a walk. I genuinely wanted to see if there was a trail over there, so I headed in the direction where I saw the man the day before. It took me about 10 minutes to walk through the brush to get to those pines, but there didn't seem to be any footpath. I checked the ground for boot prints, but the forest floor was all pine needles, so it didn't hold any tracks. After looking around, I walked back to the A-frame and went about my day. I chopped more wood and organized my gear. When the sun started going down again, I went out to the edge of the deck to dump my coffee grounds, and again, I saw him. He was in the exact same spot as the day before. He was just a dark shape against the gray trunks. I stared at him for a while, feeling my stomach drop. He never moved or even shifted his weight, so I went inside and locked the door immediately. Within the hour, I was in the loft, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. Sometime through the night, though, I woke up. The wood stove had burned down to embers and the cabin was freezing. I stayed under the covers for as long as I could, hoping I could just ignore the cold, but I could see my breath in the air. I threw on my boots and a heavy jacket, grabbed the lantern and went outside to the wood pile that was stacked against the side of the shack. I grabbed a few logs, but as I turned to go back inside, I noticed marks in the frost on the deck railing. I leaned in closer, and I was sure they were handprints. The frost had melted where someone had gripped the wood. Then I looked at the floorboards. There were wet boot prints leading from the stairs, right up to the railing, and then stopping directly in front of the sliding glass door. I looked at the glass and realized the prints were facing in. That man had walked up the stairs, stood at the railing, and then pressed his face against the glass to watch me sleep. I looked out toward the pines, where I had seen him standing. It was pitch black. The woods were empty. My blood ran cold. I dropped the wood and bolted for my truck. I tore out of that driveway without even locking the cabin up. I don't know who he was or how long he had been standing on the deck, but I have never gone back to ask. This took place when I was about 14 years old. At the time, my best friend was a kid named Caleb, who lived a few houses down from me. Our neighborhood was pretty new, but it was built right next to this massive patch of forest that went on for miles. Since there wasn't much to do in the suburbs, we spent pretty much every weekend in those woods making forts or playing games. We were obsessed with playing manhunt, which is basically just tag butt at night. The rules were simple, where one person counts at the edge of the yard, and the other person has to run and hide in the woods. The person who is it has to find and tag the runner before they can make it back to the base. We usually played with flashlights, but you were allowed to turn them off if you wanted to be sneaky. It made the game way more intense because you never really knew if the other person was right next to you or a mile away. We usually stuck to the trails we knew, but this one night, I decided I was going to win no matter what. So I ran way deeper than usual. I knew Caleb was afraid of the deep woods, so I figured if I went far enough, he would just give up and go home. It was getting super cold and the moonlight wasn't making it through the trees very well, so I was basically running blind. After running for what felt like 10 minutes, I stumbled across this old hunting shack. It looked like it was falling apart, and had definitely been abandoned for years. I knew this was the perfect spot to wait out the timer, so I pried the door open and went inside. It was tiny and smelled like wet wood and mold. There was nothing in there except a broken chair and some trash on the floor. I stood by the window that faced back toward the house, waiting to see Caleb's flashlight. I figured I would see his beam bouncing through the trees long before he got close to me. I waited there for probably 20 minutes. Finally, I heard leaves crunching outside. I smiled because I thought Caleb was trying to sneak up on me without his light. I crouched down below the windowsill, planning to jump out and scare him when he opened the door. I listened as the footsteps got closer and closer, until they stopped right on the front porch. The wood creaked under the weight. Just as I was about to yell, "Gotcha!" I looked out through a crack in the wall and saw a beam of light sweep across the trees, way off to my left. It was Caleb. He was yelling my name and waving his flashlight probably 100 yards away. My stomach dropped. If Caleb was all the way over there, then the person standing on the porch wasn't him. I slowly backed away from the door and squeezed myself into the corner behind some old shelves. The door handle started to turn slowly. It was rusted, so it made a loud screeching noise. The door pushed open, and a tall figure stepped into the room. It was too dark to see his face, but he was huge, way bigger than any kid. He stood there in the doorway, just breathing heavily. He didn't have a flashlight. I held my breath so hard my chest hurt. After standing there for a minute, he took a step inside and kicked the broken chair across the room. It hit the wall right next to my head, but I didn't move. He stayed in there for another minute before he turned around and walked back out onto the porch. I waited until I heard his boot step off onto the dirt, and then I made my move. I scrambled out the window on the backside of the shack. I ran blindly, until I saw Caleb's light. I ran straight at him, screaming his name. He shined the light in my face and started laughing, thinking he had caught me. But then he looked past me and stopped laughing. He grabbed my arm and started running back toward the house without saying a word. We got back to my driveways and locked ourselves in the garage. Caleb was pale. He asked me who the guy was that was chasing me. He said he saw a man running full speed right behind me until we hit the streetlights. I told him everything that happened in the shack, and we both agreed we were done with the woods. We told my dad that we saw a coyote, just to explain why we were so freaked out. But we didn't tell him about the man because we knew he would never let us go outside at night again. My dad went out with a bat to look around the yard, but obviously didn't find anything. We stopped playing manhunt after that night. Even now when I visit my parents, I look out at that tree line and wonder if that guy is still living in that shack, just waiting for kids to wander too far.